Refugees are fleeing Ukraine by the thousands as Russia appears to have stepped up its attacks. Today, Russian bombs hit several civilian areas, including a building near Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. Ukraine's president declared the attack a war crime and is set to meet with Russian officials again in the coming days. And joining us to discuss this situation abroad is Ukrainian-American journalist Julian Hayda, who claimed residence in Ukraine in January. He's a former producer of WBEZ's Worldview program. Julian Hayda, welcome back. You were last in Ukraine about a month ago. What are you hearing from your contacts on the ground right now?
Well, thanks, Paris, for having me on the show. I'm hearing a lot of uncertainty, and I think it's a pretty fair response. Whereas on Thursday, when bombs started to fall across Ukraine, 1,000 miles across, in cities east and west, north and south, while the indiscriminate nature of the air raids, of the rocket fire, seems to have settled down and the attacks seem to now focus around more strategic cities. So at first you had kind of like a shock and awe situation that people are still trying to shake off and people still don't necessarily feel safe wherever they are. Now it is truly, the skies are opening up in places where Russia is trying to make land advances from the north, past Chernobyl into Kiev, from the south, from Crimea, which has been occupied since 2014, and from the newly recognized by Russia breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine that are also pushing people west, and Kharkiv, which, although having resisted any sort of serious separatist movement over the last 8 years, is nonetheless very close to the Russian border. And so that's the city that we saw attacked this morning in addition to Kiev. In Kharkiv, 10 people are dead. Imagine it being Grant Park. It's the center of town, right next to a major financial district, right next to some major universities. And it's shocking because many of the attacks so far have been on the outskirts of cities, military installations, infrastructure, and now we're seeing rockets strike the middle of urban centers.
And Julian, so you mentioned Kharkiv, you mentioned Kiev, a lot of reporting about convoys getting closer to those cities, and you mentioned the horrible air attacks on Kharkiv this morning. Is the consensus that Russia is going to step up its attacks on these cities?
It's hard to say. I mean, the consensus seems to be that Russia wasn't expecting such a strong fight on the part of the Ukrainians, based on Ukrainian numbers. So, again, this is just one side of the conflict, but Ukrainians are managing to have a casualty rate of 1 Ukrainian to 10 Russians. So I don't think anybody on the Russian side was expecting Ukrainians to put up such a fight. 80,000 people, according to Ukraine's government, have entered Ukraine to volunteer in the war effort, the French Foreign Legion. So the fight is ongoing. I think they've predicted Kiev to fall like 2 or 3 times already, and it hasn't. Granted, it's only been 5 days. So.
Well, that's my next question to you, Julian.
Yeah.
They've valiantly held off Russian forces in places like Kiev. How long do you think Ukrainian forces with these reinforcements can continue to do this, especially knowing the kind of artillery Russian forces have?
Well, what I think a lot of people might be most surprised by is how much this is an air war. So Ukraine has been rather effective with, for example, stopping certain convoys. There was a convoy of 800 Russian vehicles in the south of Ukraine that was destroyed today by Ukraine's Air Force, and Ukraine is now getting Russian or Soviet-made airplanes sent to them by the European Union, which made the very unprecedented step of, as a bloc, providing Ukraine with weapons. So while Ukrainians, I don't think, want this to escalate. They're, I think, properly equipped even today, more than they even were a few days ago. They're fighting for their homes, and that is a lot more compelling than what Russians are fighting for, which is uncertain. Nobody in Russia is really sure what the fight is on about. And Russian media is reporting no casualties or few casualties, although some officials have let slip of their casualties. And yet in cities like St. Petersburg, there are thousands of anti-war demonstrators, and people are getting arrested in droves. So it's really kind of also a war of information and will. That these Russian soldiers aren't sure what to follow and what to listen to.
And we've heard, Russians shutting down whatever remaining independent media outlets they have, and just sticking with their state-sponsored propaganda. Julian, what are you hearing about the evacuation efforts? We've heard stories of African students there, Middle Eastern students, not being allowed on buses or trains. Tell us about the evacuation effort.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of those painful reports as well. I think there was a great deal of confusion and frankly, lack of preparedness on the side of Ukraine. Again, half the country wasn't really expecting the war to escalate in such a way. And then you had the government of Poland originally extend a kind of a temporary refugee regime with citizens of Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is a very diverse and multi-ethnic country. Afro-Ukrainians have been in Ukraine for over 100 years. So there are Black citizens of Ukraine who have the rights of citizens of Ukraine. And I think the confusion is some of them being profiled with the up to 20,000 African students, exchange students, who don't necessarily have the same civil rights. And a lot of that has led to tragic situations at the border with people being turned away.
Right, we've heard those reports. We have to keep following all this. We'll have you back, Julian, to continue to talk about this. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Paris.